Good morning, Stuart, and thank you very much for giving some time to the Mint to talk about your book, Food Fight.
Thank you, Henry. Great to be here.
Brilliant. Well, I thought I'd start with, you giving some illustrations of what we're fighting against, because your book has some quite horrifying but fascinating stories of the sort of antics of corporate and governments and so on. And just to give a flavour, because obviously your book is huge and covers a lot, but
Sure.
give some examples.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to start with why, actually. Why are we fighting? Or what is the fight? I mean, we're basically in a situation where we have a global food system, and it is global in the sense that most of the food that we consume derives from the products and practices of just a handful of large transnationals in this global food system. This global food system is now causing more damage than it is producing benefit or value. And that's not just me saying, that's been costed out by the Food Systems Economic Commission a year ago at around about $15 trillion a year, which is 12% of GDP. So it's a dysfunctional system. It's driving huge, large-scale harms across the world now, both in terms of human health, but also environmental degradation through deforestation, biodiversity loss. It's driving climate change via a third of all greenhouse gas emissions driven by this food system we have. That's the challenge, but it's not as easy as sort of saying, right, well, we'll get rid of that, because the problem is that the most profitable products that are sold within this operative system are the least healthy for us as humans, they're least healthy for the planet. So therein lies the challenge. We have a system driven to maximize profit by selling products that are by and large, not in every case, but by and large, not particularly healthy for us. Ultra processed foods and junk foods. So that's the challenge. And the fight on our hands is to transform this system. And I think I would actually argue the system is not really broken. We hear this cliche, we have a broken food system. I think the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do by those who control it. What we need is a different system. So it's not just about tinkering at the margins or repairing. We need a fundamental transformation into a system which is driven much more by a different purpose. Let me get my earplug back in. Different purpose, which is to nourish us, nourish people and planet. So that's the subtitle of the book, From Plunder and Profit to People and Planet. The fight is not just against these transnational corporations, Nestle, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, General Mills, Mondelez, Unilever, Kraft Heinz, etc. It's also a struggle to change the parameters and reset the rules of the system, which is the responsibility of governments. And actually, even if you look at those that 10 or so big companies, they are themselves being driven via investments from BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and other hedge funds and asset management firms who are buying up ever larger proportions of shares of these companies to maximize profit for shareholders, and to vote against improving the healthiness of portfolios of these companies, which regularly pops up now at annual general meetings. So therein lies the challenge. We're dealing with a situation which has kind of been locked in to maximize profits by generating harm.
And can you give us some illustrations of what sort of behaviors that leads to? I mean, I was particularly struck by your descriptions of Nestle and obviously famously the milk substitutes, and even that this, I always thought that was historical, but we heard recently, that there's 10 times as much sugar still in what goes to Africa. Tell me about your experience, because you were actually there there in the room, weren't you?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the recent story about Nestle is quite shocking. And the book itself has quite a lot of stories about Nestle. Is the oldest and the biggest food company by and large. And we know about 50 years ago, there was a big scandal around what was called the baby killer scandal in terms of the way in which infant formula was being marketed aggressively to displace breastfeeding. It led to hundreds of, actually 11 million deaths since 1980 of babies. In the year that the International Code on Breast Milk Substitutes was founded in 1981, there were 181,000 child deaths due to the inappropriate practices of marketing by Nestle. Nestle now is says it's trying to move in a different direction. It keeps changing its CEO due to various dalliances with what are termed subordinates, but that's another story. What Nestle have been doing is putting sugar in products that are being marketed to Asian kids, and now we've found out just recently African kids, but those same products do not have added sugar in global north countries. So we find this practices like this are still continuing. Again, sugar is something that is harmful, and it's been linked obviously to obesity, type 2 diabetes in terms of overdosing, especially young kids. But that's setting in place a lifelong potential addiction to sugar that is really harmful. But the middle chapter in the book is called The Dark Arts, and that is where I try to look at the corporate playbook. The book is about power. Power comes in many different forms. Obviously, there's economic power, financial power. But the interesting part, at least to me when I was writing, was the way in which this huge financial power is used to drive and translate into political power via a set of tactics that are used to stop governments from getting in the way of companies making large profits from this stuff. And I call those the deadly Ds. They are now, it'd take too long to go into all of them, but they are disputing the evidence or sowing doubt on the evidence. The second D is distortion, and that is via changing the narrative, blaming the consumer. It is also one legal form of distortion is via lobbying practices. The third D is distraction, and that is where, if you think of a company as a person with a left hand and a right hand, the right hand is the core business, which is still driving large-scale harm. The left hand is corporate social responsibility, and it's very media-friendly. Companies want you to see what they're doing in terms of corporate social responsibility, which in and of itself may be good, but it's a distraction. The fourth D is disguise. Companies they don't come to the policy table themselves. They may not come to the conferences themselves. They pay trade associations and front groups to do that for themselves. So 268 front groups, associations in the food world, and Nestle, for example, are paid up members of 175 of them. And the last D is dodge. And that can be tax dodging via shifting the tax liabilities wherever they want to around the world, because they can, to find low tax havens. So there's a kind of a playbook. A lot of that has been adopted and adapted from big tobacco years ago. There are many stories within that. I capture a few in the book. I keep trying to update them on Substack. But yeah, it's another example of how power can be, when it gets that big, or when companies get that powerful in terms of their economic and financial clout, they can use that to drive political power and media as well. That's another thing. Yeah.
And you also wrote about how then they actually buy the governments to support them and to stop international regulation.
Yes.
The US government has banned or stopped international regulation to address this, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a famous story from 21 years ago, actually, 2004, when the World Health Organization was blocked in its attempts to develop an international sort of standard around healthy diets and physical activity, as obesity was beginning to rise dramatically. And the US government, the US companies used the US government to block the mention of anything like sugar or even practices of the companies in this document, and watered it down and diluted it. Also, we have a situation wherein governments again do the bidding of various companies in terms of blocking blocking other international agreements, but also the behaviors of national governments who are trying to change and improve the healthiness of the food system in their countries. For example, Thailand, through the WTO, they were blocked put pressure on to keep the markets open for sugary products. This we see all the time, and that's been going on for some time now.
And I suppose you can see the logic of this because I suppose, as I understood it, one of the key dynamics here is that these big companies have to keep on growing and making more and more profit. So logically, they have to keep developing more and more markets, i.e. displacing healthy food and replacing it endlessly. So they're always trying to find new opportunities to sell junk to people and stop them eating actually something healthy and not within their control.
Exactly, Henry. You hit the nail on the head there. It's a deliberate drive to displace other healthier products, and that can be done. And they have to keep growing, and they keep growing via new geographies, moving into different countries or regions, but also developing different products which are variants on the same theme. That's why we have 172 versions of Pringles. God knows how many Kit Kats. I mean, it's all intended to continue to manufacture desire, continue to manufacture or drive overconsumption on the part of consumers through growing as a company in terms of sales, whether it's in different parts of the world or in different types of products.
I came across quite a good sort of summary of that, is that we have an economy now that produces bullshit abundance.
Yes.
And scarce and artificial scarcity of actually what we need.
Yeah. That's Radical Abundance. Yeah.
Yes, the Radical Abundance book.
Yeah, I skimmed through that. That is absolutely spot on. Yeah, and I would totally subscribe to that. We are in that overload situation, which of course we're going to see a lot more in the next few weeks over Christmas.
So, shall we move now to the fight back?
Yeah.
Because it's sort of interesting. I was reflecting, that if you look in the fossil fuels area, you've got, Greenpeace for some time, sort of climbing up chimneys, putting, the sort of dramatic fight, it's sort of visible. And I suppose the fight against big food doesn't seem to be quite so visible. People aren't on the streets. No. There aren't groups who are creating, sort of getting it into the news, etc., etc. Yeah. Do you know why is that, do you think, and how could that change?
That's a good, I agree, Henry. And I asked in the book, why don't we have Just Stop Oil? Why don't we have Just Stop Junk? And it's a good question. I think it may be beginning to change, actually, in the sense that I think more and more, certainly we see from surveys that the public are pretty fed up with the unhealthiness of their high streets. What's the corner shop next to the kids' school, and it's so saturated with ultra processed products. So, so I think it is potentially going to change, or is changing, and I think it's all about putting pressure on governments to do the right thing. And we can do that as individuals, or we can do it collectively via community groups, NGOs. But the whole raft of things that governments can do, and they're connected. You ever think about that? The fossil fuel. We talk about climate change. A lot of the pressure which is being put on fossil fuel industry relates to the climate and environmental degradation. We see the same thing with ultra processed food products. A lot of the greenhouse gas emissions, second after fossil fuels themselves, are related to the food system. So there are links and there are connections which maybe we have not been. Maybe we need to make more clearly and more proactively in terms of those kind of connections.
In the US, you had the MAHA movement, didn't you? Make America Healthy Again, which seemed to be a bigger, or at least as far as I could see, a bigger sort of social movement across the bit. What's happened to that?
That MAHA is a kind of a weird maverick movement, which is because it's largely been driven by a weird maverick. RFK Jr., who was quite flaky with regard to obviously his anti-vax stance. And the reality is MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, on the one hand, and MAGA, Make America Great Again on the other hand. You have RFK on one hand, you have Trump on the other. MAGA is always going to win over any battle with MAHA. MAHA was intending or stated that it was about to take on the ultra-processed food industry. It hasn't really done that. It's brought out two reports. The first report was written by AI, and it got a lot of stuff wrong, which is trying to set out what the problem was. The second report was meant to talk about action, strategy, and that was completely weak. I was so weak because it was all talking about voluntary deals with industry, which we know time and time again fail and have failed and will continue to fail. It needs to be mandatory. It needs to be systemic. It's not just about putting sugar back in Coca-Cola and taking out the high fructose corn syrup or whatever. It's about being systemic, and that has never really happened so far, and I don't think it will happen because MAGA will always win out, and MAGA is for big business, and big business includes big food.
One of the examples of success, if you like, is often quoted as the tax on sugary drinks, which in the last budget was just extended to milkshakes, I think, and something else, wasn't it? And I wonder, and you seemed in your book, I took it you were quite positive about these. I wonder because I've also heard that, obviously this has encouraged these food companies, big food, to reformulate, but the reformulations, there's no guarantee that they're any better than the previous formulation, in that you just have artificial sweeteners and so on.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the tax is important, and I think we need to go. By the way, the recent announcement on the milkshakes, I couldn't understand why we have to wait 2.5 years for this. I mean, it's only going to kick in April 2028, which is very strange in itself. But again, that's part of probably some deal with industry. They say, oh, we need 2.5 years. We don't need 2.5 years to do this. Anyway, it has to go beyond just taxing sugar. I think we need to move in a direction that, as they are doing in Latin America, especially Colombia, where junk food taxes. But you made a good point about reformulation. You can't really properly reformulate your way out of an ultra-processed dominated food portfolio. Because it's the processing. So the reformulation will be a form of ultra processing. It'll be tinkering with different levels of salt, sugar, saturated fats, when there's often something else we know there's something else driving harm beyond the levels of these nutrients. And I think we need a more systemic approach to thinking what food systems are for. We need a conversation about values in the food system. And therefore, the kind of health, minimally processed foods needs to be incentivized via government policy to become more front and center of portfolios of these companies. The other part of tax, and I've talked about this, and I don't know if you might be able to see that. That's a kind of a seesaw, what I call a kind of fiscal seesaw, wherein governments need to really look at ways, in the same way as polluter pays principle, taxing harmful products, reforming or reassessing upstream subsidies on some of these staple crops that end up as ultra-processed foods. But importantly, to use as far as possible, creatively, imaginatively, the dividend on the revenues from that tax in ways that incentivize or support, especially low-income families, to access and afford healthy diets. So it's that rebalancing of the food system towards health, away from profit from harmful products towards health. And I think there's a huge potential there that's just we haven't even begun to tap into.
But I mean, one of the messages I took from your book early on was government is as much part of the problem, if you like, as companies, because of course the companies buy the government, and you can see obviously a lot of stories you had were about the US government acting obviously as proxies promoting their big food, but our government in the UK as well, obviously they are promoting economic growth, and they're not bothered about the nature of the economic growth, and so far I think the Food Foundation, the King's Fund, The Health Foundation wrote a letter saying the government was backing down over many issues. And I mean, can we rely? Is there?
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I think that, yeah. I've been the more I looked at this, the more I realized that, yeah, we governments have been sort of, they've bought this notion, they've been sold this notion of the big food being the drivers of economic growth. If you look at it in a 5, 10, 15-year perspective, I think there's a report coming out shortly called the Net Drain. It's from the Net Drain project, which basically shows, I think, and I hope persuasively, that we're actually going backwards with regard to economic growth. It's an economic net cost of industry's unfettered approach to producing ultra processed foods. And so it's a fallacy in many ways. There was exactly a year ago, there's a headline that came out in The Guardian showing that £268 billion a year was the cost of our addiction to junk food. 2/3 of that falls on individuals and households in terms of ill health, in terms of premature death, in terms of lost productivity because of many, an epidemic of sick days that we see in this country. The other third falls directly on the NHS and care services. That's a huge cost, but it's a cost that you don't see day in, day out. It's not very visible, and it's cumulative, and it happens over a long period of time. And so politicians can say it's nothing to do with us, and they can look for ways of not doing it, or it's a hard challenge to make visible the harms and there's a phrase, slow violence of dysfunctional food systems that we have, because without making it visible, it's hard to generate the political will and the public will to actually change it.
So is the problem not the food system, but the capitalist system? Because effectively what you're talking about is capitalist dynamics. The food system is just like any other bit of the economy, dominated by capitalist dynamics, right, which require onward growth and profit and create powerful organizations that then buy governments, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an economist. You are. I started digging into this as much as possible. I'm not going to say whether we need to overthrow capitalism. If companies can make profits and use profits in ways which are pro-people, pro-planet, that's an if. Then I would, ultimately long-term, if that is feasible, if we can shift the balance there to incentivize minimally or processed foods in a food system that companies can live with, then that's where we need to be heading, whether that's capitalism or not. It's that's questionable. But what we can't have, I cannot see in any way that we could continue with business as usual and hope to escape in any way, and then we'd get anywhere close to net zero, or on the climate side, but in the health side with regard to obesity. And this won't be solved. The obesity crisis won't be solved with the weight loss jabs. There's massive issues around equity with regard to those. They're a good therapy and a good treatment, but for those that can access them. But it's not a population level, large scale policy that we need to subscribe to as the main driver way of controlling obesity. So yeah, economic systems, we have to look at, again, it's about value and food. What is food for? Another part we haven't talked about, because food is so central to everything, is culture. Our food culture. There was a colleague of mine from Brazil who had seen in her country the streets swamped with junk foods and snacks, and she said, we have that as our challenge. But in Britain, it seems like you've lost your meals as well. Not only do you have snacks everywhere and all times, but it looks like that there's no longer a three meals where families sit together, and so she said that's taken over your food culture. That's the way she saw it, which is interesting. Yeah.
Well, what about, I mean, we met recently at Plunder, didn't we? And obviously there are a lot of people there who are interested in local food systems, I suppose as an opportunity to try and create local food economies that are not driven by that logic and are more embedded in culture, in connection, relationships, etc. I mean, obviously, this area is tiny, but do you think that is a promising direction?
That's a really fascinating question and challenge. I have to say, my book was not so much about the upstream issues about land and land use and agriculture. It was more downstream, if you like, consumer citizen side. And I've begun to dig into looking at localized food systems. It's about incentives and priorities of governments. Again, but I haven't really got to grips with that full literature around local food systems. But it's a fascinating. There are many good success stories around that, and I think again it's about looking at ways of incentivizing and supporting that kind of movement in the food system, especially prioritizing local farmers. There are other interesting examples from overseas. So in Brazil, they have an amazing school feeding program now, which is supporting local farmers because they provide the food for school feeding, and it's low carbon, organic, local produce. And there are also cooking classes in schools. So you see this amazing win-win-win situations developing through that. We've moved so far away from that in this country. But I'm not an expert on farming in the UK, but there's a huge potential there, surely.
Well, hopefully. I mean, I really enjoyed your book, and but it gives a frightening, scary, and detailed account of a system, of a capitalist food system, maybe that is just so destructive. So, how we can find a different way, I suppose, is the big question, isn't it?
Sure, absolutely, yeah, and as I say, I think things there seems to be. Maybe I'm just biased because I'm embedded in it at the moment, but there seems to be movement in the right direction. I hope this government gets it eventually and realizes it's not a vote loser to take on this captured system that we have.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us, and I look forward to further conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Henry. Really enjoyed it.